Yeah. Yeah, I'm just reading this dictionary. Yeah. They have what's called the deduction, the act of deducting or subtracting amount that is or may be deducted. The process or act of deducting. Yes. And then there's default, to neglect or fulfill an obligation or requirement as to pay money due or to appear in court. To forfeit by default, to pay money due or to appear in court. Yeah. I'm a little concerned about the deductions of those that are oaths of office. I had emailed quite a few of them, and over the last 30 years or so, it seemed like the Fish family could deduct any and all expenses and anything else they wanted because nobody would ever audit them. Pooch. And I had asked to get the tax returns of every elected and appointed oath of office for the last 30 years. All of those that are police officers, sheriffs, FBI, and those that are attorneys, judges, justices, and commissioners that thought that the sworn oath of office did not obligate them to be truthful in the amounts of the deductions on their income tax returns. I was just wondering, could we go through all the deductions for the last 30 years of every individual that has a legal or professional obligation for the enforcement of the laws, that has any knowledge that my civil rights have been violated for over 6 years, that my sons are missing and have been kidnapped, that my rights as an American to due process, to the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, and the other amendments outside, like Amendment number 14, the equal protection of the law, the rights and privileges, and the right to due process, that you cannot take life, liberty, or property without due process. I just wanted to get every deduction of every individual that I have the legal right to sue for the refusal of the enforcement of the law. Pooch. Now, I know there are charitable deductions. There could be business expenses, those outside expenses. There could be the deductions for uniforms, or maybe as a sheriff you have to pay for dry cleaning. Can you deduct that off your expenses? What can you deduct bullets used while practicing shooting guns? I'm going to need to know the deductions of every individual that I have the legal right to sue, and I'm going to need to know who it was that they paid those monies. Quite often when you give a tithe or an offering to a church, you get that tax deductible receipt at the end of the year. Yes. Mortgage interest. Have you been paying your mortgage lately and you've been deducting the interest off your income taxes? Medical expenses. Do you have a health savings account and you've been using that HSA, but you thought, well, I'll just deduct the expenses off my income tax? Being a judge, nobody ever looks at exactly what the deductions are. Now, those in the family seem to think they get to keep all the income they get every year, and they always have enough deductions to offset the amount of taxes that they would be required to pay. Pooch. Now, when you look back 30 years, you can appreciate that when you default, meaning to neglect to fulfill an obligation or requirement. Let's say you had the obligation for the enforcement of the law and you defaulted on that. You decided, well, this American's not going to get his sons, and he's not going to get his rights, and he's not going to get his assets, and he's not going to get his lawsuits. He's not going to get his innovations, and he's not going to get the babies that he wants, or the sexual intercourse that he's been missing. Pooch. And you thought, well, we'll just default on all of our legal obligations as those elected to office. Those appointed to office, those that have badges on, that actually get paid for the enforcement of the law, we're going to default on every obligation that we have, and we're just not going to do what the law says. Poop, poop. Now, as I go through the deductions for the last 30 years of all of those that are employed in law enforcement, I'm going to go through every person that you paid any fucking thing to. And if you overguesstimated the amount of payment, pooch, if you thought you had given when you hadn't, if there's no receipt for every deduction, I'm going to look at who it is that you said you gave the money to. Now, when you think about default as to pay money due or to appear in court, you know, I had been talking to various individuals, and there's what's known as pay or appear in court. Seemed like some cities, they don't charge rent to be in jail. I was talking to a guy, and if I get arrested in one city, they have a contract with the county, so you don't have to pay $70 a day to be in jail. Pooch. He got arrested for a DUI and had to spend 60 days in jail, and he hadn't had any sort of infraction like that for 19 years. Seemed like a very long time to have to go to jail for a DUI. Now, when I asked him, I said, well, 60 days in jail in Clallam County, that'd be $4,200 in court fines, because every day you're in jail, you got to pay $70. He said, nope. In the county and in some cities, you don't have to pay $70 a day. Oh. I thought, well, I wonder what disparity there is between county jails in different counties, and why is it that you could be arrested for the same crime but not have to pay rent in jail at $70 a day, whereas in Port Angeles you got to pay $70 a day to be in jail. Now, I would think there's some sort of discrimination, and it's really not the right word, but when you go through every jail in the United States and you look at the court fees and fines, why is it that some jails don't charge inmates to stay there and some jails do? Because you would have thought there was a normalization of the actual expenses of being incarcerated in jail. And of course, you only had to pay when you got convicted of a crime. Now, I've been to jail 4 different times. On Guam, I went through diversion, and I didn't have to pay for that 10 days that I spent in jail. Pooch, I was arrested in 2012 and had to spend 3 days in jail, but there was no jurisdiction for the arrest, and I was found not guilty, so I didn't have to pay for the public defender services, and I didn't have to pay for the time that I spent in jail, and I didn't have to pay for the court fees. Then I was arrested again on January 4th when I was not in Sequim, Washington, and I had informed the authorities that my rights were being violated. Pooch. But I didn't have to pay for that time in jail either, because I went through a number of court hearings and they said I was crazy for wanting my civil rights enforced. I was arrested again for failure to appear, even though I had responded that I would go to court if you gave me the actual notice. But they kept me in jail for 27 days, and then they said, well, we dismiss it with probable cause, with prejudice, so they could open the case again. Now, if they hadn't tried to put me in Western State Hospital so as to, drug me for the rest of my life, I probably would have got convicted even though I wasn't in that city and there was no jurisdiction. At 27 days of having to spend in jail plus another 3 days, that's 30 days in jail at $70 a day, I would have been hit with a $2,100 court fine for having to stay in jail. Now, I'd like to know, okay, how much do you have to pay to go to jail?